Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, hi.
Hi. We're really excited to be launching the KISS Digital Academy. So this will be the first in a series of what will be bi-weekly webinars. The sessions are designed essentially to empower you and your organization with the knowledge and skills needed to thrive within the digital age. So without further ado, I will hand over to Amanda, who will be leading the session. So do enjoy the session, and I'll pass over to Amanda.
Hi, everyone. My name's Amanda, and the session today is going to be an introduction to Excel functions and formulas. So you should all be able to use your microphones. What I'm going to ask you to do is when we start, just mute them. If, as we're going through, you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute the mic or drop the question into the chat. At the end of the session, there will be a Q&A. So if you've got questions you want to ask at the end, feel free to ask them in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop into the chat a file that I'll be using today. So hopefully you can see the file in the chat, and that's the file that I'll be going through today during the session. So we're still possibly going to have a few extra people joining, but I will make a start. Excel is one of those applications that people generally either love or hate. And I'm guessing if you're here, it's probably because you hate it and try to avoid using it. So hopefully today I will show you that it is not an application that you need to be worried about using. We're going to start from the very basics. So don't worry if you've never even opened Excel before. We'll start with the basics, and by the end of the session today, you should be able to use basic functions and formulas, as well as a few other tips and tricks that I will pass on as we do the session. So Excel. Standard Microsoft Office application, so you should be familiar with the idea of the quick access toolbar and the ribbons across the top. Underneath that, we have this extra section that you're not necessarily going to be familiar with. You've probably seen this if you've opened Excel, but not necessarily sure of what it is or what it does. So the first section is what we call the name box. So in here, there is the name of the cell that I'm currently in. If I change cells, it changes the name. It has other uses as well, and if you join us on one of our later sessions, we'll show you how the name box comes into play with other things that you can do. And then there's this big long bar here, which is your formula bar. The formula bar shows me what's actually in the cell, and we'll talk about that more when we look at doing some calculations. Underneath that, I've got my spreadsheet, which is broken down into columns, which I have across the top, the letters, and rows down the left-hand side. And then each cell or intersection is given a name. So because this is in column F and row 4, its name up here in the name box is F4. I've got a few worksheets that we're going to be going through for the session. So I'm going to skip along to the next one, which is introduction. So this is the bit that most people start going, oh, I don't want to do that, because it's the maths part. And I promise there is only a little bit of maths. So in here, I've got some numbers. And what I want to do is a calculation with those numbers. And I want to do 2 plus 3 times 4. Now, doing that in my head, 2 plus 3 is 5, times 4 is 20. So I would expect the answer to be 20. So in here, I'm going to do the calculation. So we always start with equals if we want Excel to work anything out. Otherwise, it's just going to do what it did in here and give me whatever I type in. So equals is our way of telling Excel, I want you to calculate something. And then I'm just going to type 2 plus 3 times, which is the asterisk, 4. When I press enter, Excel will do that calculation for me. So there we go. Excel has told me that the answer to that sum is 14. And this is where the bit of maths comes in. You may or may not at school, if you were me many years ago, have heard of BODMAS, sometimes called BIDMAS. It is the order of operations in maths, operations being things like add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And there are strict rules in maths that Excel has to follow. So when you write out a sum, like we've done here, it always does anything in brackets first. Then we have orders or indices, if you learnt bid maths, which is to the power of. So that's the little caret symbol that you will find if you press Shift and 6. Then it does divide and multiply, and at the very end it will do add and subtract. So if we look at this sum, there are no brackets, there's no to the power ofs, there is no divide, but there is a multiply. So the first thing Excel will do is this multiplication, 3 times 4, which is 12. Having done that, it then does the add at the start. So 2 plus 12 is 14. So that's normally the first reason that people decide Excel is not for them, because they expect 20, they get 14. If I want to change that to force it to do the add first, I need to put it inside the brackets, because if you remember in the order of operations, anything in brackets is done first, then it will do the multiply afterwards. Press enter and now I get 20. That's all well and good. These are the numbers I used. I change one of the numbers and my answer doesn't change. So what I would like you to think about when you're doing any functions or formulas in Excel is whether it is a fixed value, i.e. it's never going to change, or whether what you want is a result that will automatically update when you change something. So instead of using 2, I'm going to select the cell where the value is stored, that one there. It puts in A1 for me because I've selected it. I'm going to take out the 3 and use the cell reference instead. And instead of 4, we're now going to use whatever is in cell A3. When I press enter, if I change any of these values back to 4, for example, it recalculates what's in here, because instead of saying I want you to use the number 2, I've said I want you to use whatever is in cell A1, whatever is in cell A2, and whatever is in cell A3. So that's why we would normally use the cell references. So that's a simple formula that I've used. So not a function, we'll get to those in a second. A formula is where you start with equals and then you do a calculation that uses standard operators like add, subtract, multiply and divide. Before we go on any further, I'm just going to introduce you to some of the cursors that you see while you're using Excel. So the main one is the big white cross that you can see on the screen now, which is used for selecting. So if I click on a cell with the big white cross, it selects it. If I double click, my cursor changes to the I shape, which is my text editing, because double clicking on a cell enters into the cell for me to start typing in it. So this is text. And when I press enter, it enters that value into the cell and I go back to my big white cross. When I make a selection of a group of cells by clicking and dragging, one of the cells stays white. This is what we call the active cell, because when I start typing now without doing anything else, it goes into the active cell in that group. If I press escape, it cancels any changes I've made to that cell and I go back to how it was before. So that's the big white cross and the single and double click and what that white cell is for in the top corner. The first one I select is my active cell. The other crosses or cursors that you might see, if I go around the green edging of a selection, either a single cell or multiple cells, I change to a 4-way arrow. In all Office applications, the 4-way arrow is move. And if I click and drag, it allows me to move this to a different place in my spreadsheet. There is another cross that you will find going around the edge in green, which is down here in the bottom right-hand corner of my selection. There's a little green square, and if I put my cursor over it, it changes to a little black cross. That's what we call the fill handle, and we'll be looking at that next. So skipping along to my next worksheet, my basic functions. So functions are basically formulas with fancy names. And the whole idea of functions is that you don't actually need to know the maths behind it because Excel does all that for you. The only thing you need to know is what the function is called. So we're going to look at some basic functions. And across the top on my home ribbon, there is a little symbol, sigma, with a drop down. This is what's known as AutoSum. And underneath the drop down, I've got different functions that will do different things. So these are my basic functions. There is more functions, and we'll talk about some of the other functions in a bit, but these are the functions that are defined as the basic functions. I have a price survey that I did. Notice the disclaimer, they are not actual prices. I really wish they were. And I've pretended to go to different supermarkets to buy the same list of items and recorded the prices, because what I'd like to know is which supermarket is cheapest. With a function, I will always start with where I want my answer to go. So I'm going to click into B12 because that's the total that I want to find for Tesco's for these items. Because I want a calculation, I start with equals. So far, nothing is different from how we were before. But if I was to use standard operators, I'd have to click on that one and then do a plus, and then this one and do a plus, and so on. Not only am I now bored, but the chances are I'm going to click on the wrong thing, particularly if there are lots of cells to add up. And that's what functions were designed for. So I happen to know that the function to add up is called sum. If I start typing S, you will get a list of all functions that are built into Excel that start with the letter S. And if I go towards the bottom, I will find sum is one of them. Each one of these I can click on and it will give me a description of what it does. So sum adds all of the numbers in a range of cells. Perfect, that's what I want. If I double click it, it types in the word sum and opens brackets. All functions have open and close brackets. They are not the same as the brackets in the order of operations in maths. So I can't put my 2 plus 3 to force it to do it first. In functions, what goes between the brackets is the information Excel needs from you to do that function. So we saw the sum function adds up a range of cells. So I'm telling Excel, add up. Excel's going, add up what? So here it tells me I need to give it the first number or numbers to add up. I can either select an individual number or I can select a range of numbers. I could do it all the way across if I wanted to. And notice that what it does is it puts in the first cell that I selected, the first in the group, then a colon, and then the last cell reference. And the colon basically means and everything in between. So we start in B4, we finish in B11, and I want to add up everything in between those two cells. You'll notice there's also a number 2 here, followed by a comma and then a few dots. So what this means is that I can do more than one range of cells. If I put a comma in now, you'll see it jumps to number 2 and I can select a new range of cells. Comma, and I've now got number 3, maybe just one cell. And I can go on selecting more and more cells until I've included everything I want for that adding up function. And when I've finished, I close the brackets, press enter, and it gives me my result. So not only is it quicker because you can click and drag and you don't have to look at which cell it is, so I'd have to look to see this is B4 or click in here and look at the name box, but it also allows me to replicate the function or formula that I've put in here using the fill handle. So what I've got, if I click back in here or double click in the cell, it nicely highlights in blue that range of cells. So I'm adding up all of these items to give me a total. I want to do the same thing for Asda and Sainsbury's and Morrison's and the Co-op. I could, in here, do the same thing, equals sum, and put in the range of cells. Or I could copy. If I do copy and then paste, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, it will add up the range for the co-op. But probably the easiest way is to click on the calculation I've just done, go and find the fill handle in the bottom right corner, click and drag across to the end, and it will put the same functional formula in all of the other cells. And what it does is it uses what we call relative cell referencing. So when I selected these cells B4 to B11, these are relative. And what that means is if I copy or drag across with the fill handle that functional formula to another cell, it will change those references relative to the original. So if I look at this one now, it's C4 to C11 rather than B4 to B11. The beauty of that is that I know as I go across, this is now D, this is E, and this is F. So instead of me having to select a different range each time, it's changing the reference for me. Going to look at a few of the other basic formulas and functions now. So average. I could do the average manually, as long as I know the mathematics behind it. So I would have to do equals, I would have to add each one of these up and then divide it by how many there are. But I don't even need to know that, because if I start typing average, there's a function that returns the average. So if I double click on that, again, what it wants is a number or numbers. What do I want to find the average of? I can click and drag to select it, close the brackets, and press enter to go down to the next row, or I can press tab, which moves me to the next cell across. So I'm now in the max column. If I type equals max, it will tell me that it returns the largest value in a set of values. So again, it wants to know where the range of values are that I want to find the maximum value of. So again, I will give it these cells here. Close the brackets and tab again. Start with equals. This time I want the minimum, min. Open brackets, click and drag, close brackets, press enter. So I've got here three functions that I created, an average, a maximum, and a minimum, and I'm going to select all three, get the fill handle, and drag it down to my total row. So I've now got the average price for each of the items, the maximum price, and the minimum price. So what this does is it tells me that the maximum I could spend on those items if I went to the most expensive supermarket for each one is £20.38. The minimum is £17.81. You do have to think about how you are using the functions, because if I go to my total, which remember we added up everything above, and I drag these across, these totals are slightly different. Because what I'm doing is I'm finding the total if I spent at that supermarket. So the most expensive, whereas if I do it this way round, I'm finding the cheapest that I could buy from the supermarket. So whereas if I look at this, £2.95, £2.49, £6.79, they're all the cheapest. So is that one. I've probably picked a bad example here because Sainsbury's does seem to be the cheapest across the range. But there are some where if I went to that particular shop, it wouldn't be the most expensive across the board. And I would then be able to see what the maximum I would have to pay if I went to one of these supermarkets, rather than what the cheapest I could possibly get it for if I went to all of the other supermarkets. So that's using the fill handle to copy across the functions and formulas. What I want to do now is find out what the cost of my shopping at Tesco's is compared to the average price across all of my supermarkets. So first of all, I want to make sure that these have been copied down, because this is now the average of my totals. So in here, it's not going to be a function because I want a percentage of the total. equals the total amount spent at Tesco's out of the average price for the supermarkets. Press enter and it will tell me that that is slightly above the average cost of the supermarket. I want to do it for the rest, so I drag it across and it starts calling me a div. So something's gone wrong. Anywhere where you see a hash and then something like this error message means there's a problem with what I've done. So we're going to start by having a look at the first time an error appears, because we know this isn't working properly. So what I'm going to do is double click on it so I can check what cells it's using. So it's using the right total for Morrison's, but when I look at the average I was meant to be using, the cell reference is over here. And that's because if you remember, the cell references we've put in are relative. So I started here, I moved 1, 2, 3 columns to the right for this calculation. So it started here and moved 1, 2, 3 columns to the right. So what I need to do is I need to go back to this original calculation and I need to stop it from moving the reference to G12, which is where my average is. The quickest way of doing that is to click in that reference. So it can be before the G, after the 12, or anywhere in the middle. And then on your laptop or computer, if you press the function key, F4, you'll see it puts in $2 signs, $G, $12. The dollar sign means do not move. So this says don't move when I copy this out of column G. Don't move when I copy this out of row 12. $2 signs is what we call an absolute reference. So what that means is it doesn't matter where you copy this function or formula to, that reference will never change. So it will always look at G12. If I press F4 again, it fixes just the row. Press it again, it fixes just the column. Press it again, we go back to our relative reference. So we can have a relative reference, an absolute reference, or one of the mixed references fixing either the column or the row. In this case, I'm not copying that formula out of this row. It's always staying in row 13. So I only need to fix the column so that when I drag it across, it doesn't change from column G. But it's equally valid for me to just go with the first option, which was the dollar in front of both. Excuse me. You don't have to use the function key F4, so you can just type the dollar sign in. But generally, especially if you're doing an absolute reference, it's a lot quicker to just press F4. By the way, if any of you are on Macs, not Windows PCs, drop me a note in the chat and I can send you across a list of Mac shortcuts so that you can do the same thing but on your Macs instead. So I'm going to press enter now, click back on it, back to my fill handle, drag it across, and it will now tell me that Sainsbury's is the cheapest when compared to the average, and the most expensive is the Co-op at nearly 108% of the average value. So they are my basic functions that I can use. I can access them from the drop down. But the reason I didn't do this is because if I go to the formulas ribbon, there is a function library. And the function library has categorized all the different functions available. So we have financial functions, logical functions, text functions, date and time, lookup and reference, maths and trigonometry, and if they weren't enough, we also have statistical, engineering, cube, information. Compatibility are the functions that at some point in the not too distant future Microsoft may remove, and then we have web functions. If what I showed you was just using AutoSum, which is also on here as well as the home ribbon, and didn't explain how a function works, that library would still be a mystery to you. But by explaining how a function works, you can, in theory, use any of these functions. So for example, if I wanted to convert this into capital letters, I can go and look for a function that will do that. It's likely to be under text. So if I have a look at this, we've got upper. If I click on upper, converts a string to all uppercase letters. The only thing it wants, notice it's put equals upper, opened and closed the brackets, and what it wants in the middle is what text to convert. I can select the text, press enter, and it will convert that to capital letters. What I need to remember is if I then copy this and paste it somewhere else, there is no reference to that text any longer. If what I wanted was just to copy the text itself, so I do my standard copy, and I wanted to put the text here, I can use the paste special, and on paste special we have the opportunity to paste just values. So this will allow me to paste just the value from the cell, values with any number formatting, or values with the formatting for the style as well. So any of those will just transfer the result and not what created it. I know the difference between the two because when I click on this one and look in my formula bar, it's just got the text. Whereas if I click on this one and look in my formula bar, it's got the function that created it instead. So that's why your formula bar is really useful, because when you click on something, you can see whether that visual representation is what's actually in the cell or whether there's something different. To give you an idea of where that might appear, if I select all of these are all monetary values. So rather than just having numbers in the cell, I'd like to have pound signs and 2 decimal places because we don't have halfpennies anymore, so there's no point in having anything less than a penny. On my home ribbon, in this section here, I've got my number formatting, and one of the options is to change it to currency. So now what I've got is I've got my nice little pound sign and everything to 2 decimal places. But if I was to click on the cell itself, I can see that these have been created using formulas rather than just the values typed in directly. Okay, so I'm going to skip along to the next one, which I've listed as accounts. So this is a company I've invented called Wizzy Widgets. We've got expenditure, we've got income, and we've got the first, second and third quarters. And what I want to do is a little bit of basic analysis on my figures to find out what my net profit is. So we're going to be doing some basic functions and formulas to get that calculation done. First of all, total expenditure. I always click where I want my answer to go. So I'm in B13 because that's where I want total expenditure to appear. It's a calculation, so I start with equals. This is where my expenditure is. So the first thing I need to decide is whether I want to write a function or a formula. Remember, if I was doing a formula, I would need to click on the cell and then do my plus. So if there's more than 2 cells, most of the time it will be quicker and easier and less likely to have errors if you use the function. Equals sum, open brackets. Between the brackets are the cells I want to add up, and then I close the brackets, press enter. I can click back on it, grab the fill handle, that little black cross, and drag it across for the other 2 quarters, which are now added up for me using the right values because they're relative references. Next, I want to do my total income. Equals. I can either use a function or a formula. There's only 2 cells, so it's probably just as quick for me to do that plus that as it is to type equals sum and select the cells. And again, I can click and drag it across. So I've got my total expenditure, I've got my total income, my gross profit will be my income minus my expenditure, equals. Now I have seen some people that might do sum that minus that. Remember, it told me what sum was for. Sum is to add up cells. We are not adding up cells. So, okay, you might think, let's go look for a function that will subtract cells. Don't bother, there isn't one. So all I'm going to have to do is my income minus expenditure. There is no function that will allow you to select a range of cells to subtract from each other. So that's my gross profit, and I can copy that across. Now I've got to pay the tax man. Boo. So I need to calculate my tax. Up here, I have a tax rate of 20%. The reason that my tax rate is here, and normally I would probably put it on a separate worksheet along with anything else that I might need to go and make changes to that I use in lots of different places, is that tax rates can change. And so I don't want to type in 20% into my calculation the way we didn't want to in here, because if the tax rate changes, I want it to update my values in here as well. So I want 20% of my gross profit. Now, if you struggle with these things like I used to, my teacher used to say, if it is of something, it is multiplied. If it's out of something, it is divide. So I want 20% of, multiply, gross profit. Press enter, and it tells me that on 17,000, I would need to pay 3,400. Copy that across for the other two, and happy days, I'm paying no tax. Something's not right, because I've made a profit, and even though I've made only a little profit, I know that 20% of 2,000 is not nothing. So let's have a look. H1 is an empty cell. Anything multiplied by nothing is nothing. What's happened is I've forgotten to go in here and for my tax rate, fix the cell reference. So in here, click at the beginning, end, in the middle, press F4, and that becomes a fixed reference. Now if I click back on it and drag it across, it's got the right values for my tax. And then finally, my net profit, gross profit, minus my tax, and copy it across. So it's really important that you understand what referencing styles are, because there may be occasions where you will want to fix the reference to a specific value, either a value that you've got here or that you've got that you've calculated as totals and you want to get values out of a total. Just to let you know, if I had put my tax rate over here, 20%, put it in there, go back to my accounts, and I'm going to redo this. So delete equals. My tax rate is on a different worksheet. Doesn't matter. All I need to do is go and find the cell and click on it. So I'm going to click back on Excel Intro, click on my cell, and then I'm going to do multiplied by. It's really important I don't try and go back to the worksheet I was on before until I've put something in after that reference. Because if I try and click back on it now and then go into here, it's very easy for me to accidentally select the wrong thing or for it to change the name of the worksheet. So if I make sure on accounts, if I do, moved it, let me just undo that. If I do equals, find the cell first and then multiply, then I can go back to my accounts worksheet and notice it's now realized I'm back in accounts and it multiplied by my gross profit, and press enter. So let's just have a look at what it's done there. So inside my single quotes, I've got Excel Intro, which is the name of the worksheet. The single quotes are because I've got a space in there. So Excel has put in the single quotes so that I know the space doesn't mean anything else. So we've got the name of the worksheet, followed by an exclamation mark, which marks the end of the worksheet reference, and then the name of the cell. So if I was coming to look at this, I would be able to click in here, have a look at the formula bar, see that there was a worksheet because there's an exclamation mark here, and I can then go and look at the worksheet. So if I press escape to cancel any changes, I can go and have a look at that value here. There is another way of checking what's being calculated as you're doing your functions and formulas. If I go to my formulas ribbon, there's a button here that says evaluate formula. If I click that, it'll bring up a box for that particular formula that I've got in here, and you'll see that it's highlighted or underscored the Excel intro B3 bit here. And if I click evaluate, it will substitute what I've got in here with the actual value. So 0.2 is my 20%. And now it's looking at what's in accounts B15. If I click evaluate, it will show me the value it's using. And now what it's going to do is it's going to use the two values that it's put in with the multiply and give me the result. So if ever you've got a calculation that you don't think looks right, select the calculation, click on evaluate formula, and you can check what's going in there step by step by clicking evaluate and watching what it's doing as it's doing the calculation for you. So hopefully that's quite a useful introduction to your functions and formulas. However, I've got a couple of other things to show you. Lists. We've all got them. We all have to work with them. I've got a list here of first name and last name, but what I want is to join them together as a full name. In the past, we used to have to do that with a function. The function was called concatenate. I couldn't even spell it, let alone write the function for it. There are new options in Excel that will allow you to do this quickly, easily, and without ever having to type equals. All I'm going to do is type the way I want the first full name to appear. So I've typed full name, I'm typing the surname, pressing enter, and then I'm going to start doing the same thing for the next one. And as soon as I do that, you'll see this ghost list appear. Excel's very good at matching patterns. What it's realized is that you have joined what was in A2 and what was in B2 with a space in C2. And as soon as I start doing the same thing with the next row, Excel goes, oh, hang on a minute, I think I know what you're doing. Would you like me to create a list with the first and last names with a space in between? If you want that list, you can press enter and it will then complete that list for you. It's a function that or feature that we call flash fill. So here I've got a little flash fill option and I can select cells that have been changed, accept suggestions, or undo the flash fill if that's not what I actually wanted. It doesn't just have to join together two cells, you can join lots of other things. So in this case, if I put KISS and then the colon and then the office, I press enter, I stop typing KISS again. Now it doesn't know what I want to do because I've started with the same thing I did before, and maybe I just want to put KISS Tamworth all the way down this list. But as long as I keep typing until it recognizes that this is not the same, and actually it thinks this might be what I want to do, it will not give me my fill list. So just keep going till you get your fill list. And now what it's done is it's joined this one with this one, and I've got my colon in between because that's what I typed. So that's flash fill. It can also do things like dates. So if I put in today's date, 24th of the 7th, 2024, and I put in tomorrow's date of the 7th, 2024, I've created a pattern. The pattern is I'm going up by one day each time. I can select them, I can drag it down, and it will continue that pattern for me. It will do the same thing with days of the week. So Monday, And if I click back on it, drag it down, it repeats the days of the week. Same thing with months. I can do the full name of the month, or I can do the part name of the month. In fact, I can even start partway through the month, through the year rather, and it will continue that pattern for me. And I can drag it across or down to create these lists. And if you don't like your times tables, let's do 9 and 18. I can just about manage 2 times 9. I can select them, drag them down, and there is my 9 times tables. So the fill handle and flash fill will allow you to create lots of different types of lists and join things together without ever having to use a function or formula. If I wanted to move this, I can select the entire column, or if I just want to select the data, a quick way to select the entire table is to start in one of the corners, hold Control and Shift at the same time on the keyboard. With those both still pressed, I'm going to use the arrow keys. I'm going to press the down arrow once, which will take me to the end of my data. So as soon as it hits a blank cell, it will stop. I'm going to then press the right arrow key once, and that will again take me to the end of my data going to the right. So that's a really quick way to select everything between two sets of points, and it will go to your contiguous data, as we call it, but basically until it hits a blank column or a blank row. Without holding Shift, I can hold Control and click the up arrow, and it will take me to the top of that list. So if all I wanted to do was select the company office, if I hold Control and Shift and press down arrow once, it makes that selection for me. Remember to move, I'm looking to go around the green outline, find the four-way arrow and click and drag, and I can move it across. Double click between the two columns at the top allows me to make that column wide enough to see the widest data in it. So that's a really quick way to make sure that you can see everything when you're scrolling down. Now the problem with moving around columns is if I clicked and wanted to put it here, it'll tell me there's already data. Do I want to replace it? I don't want to replace it, but I equally don't want to have to go in and try and put the columns in the right order or move other things out of the way first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click, and I'm still holding my mouse button. So I waited for the cursor to be my move cursor, click and hold. When I start moving, you'll see the block that represents the column. If with my mouse button still pressed, I hold the Shift key, you will see that it changes to a line and it indicates where I'm going to insert these cells. So that would be a bad idea because it would insert them in the middle of my full name list. But if I want it between last name and full name, I'm looking for the vertical line, the I bit right at the very top. Let go of the mouse button first, then the Shift key, and it will insert that for you rather than trying to replace what's there already. And just quickly before we finish, what I would like to show you, some errors. Now there are some very unhelpful error messages. If I do, for example, equals sum, select some cells, and then just put a random number in, when I press enter, it comes up with this. Sometimes it will try and give you a correction. It thinks maybe you wanted to multiply. Generally, it doesn't get it right. Not very helpful. That's the other message you might see, telling you that you've not written a formula correctly. They are not helpful. What is helpful are the error messages that you see in your cells. And I have managed to create an awful lot of error messages. You'll see these hash are in a different color because technically these are not error messages. What the hash sign is telling me is that the column is not wide enough to display numeric or date data. It doesn't care about text. So text can be wherever you like, and it can disappear into a different cell or behind another cell. But for numbers and dates, it will display the hash symbol. So to fix that, between column B and C, up at the top, I'm looking for my two-way arrow to double click to make it wide enough for the data in there. And yes, I'm aware it says bread's £10. It won't be long before that's actually true. These others all appear with the hash sign in front, and there are lots of different errors that you might see. If I click on one, generally I will see this little exclamation mark, and if I click on it, it will tell me what the issue is. So invalid name error. Not terribly helpful, some of them are better than others. But if I go and look at that by double clicking on it, I have got equals SU. SU is not the name of a function. So if I add an M to it, it becomes the name of a function. When I press enter, it will then do the calculation for me. So that was because I'd misspelt something in a calculation. Name. So if name is I've misspelt something, number generally means that I'm trying to do something that's not possible. I'm trying to do a square root of a minus number, which you can't do. If I change that to a positive, I can do a square root of 3. Value. So in here, if I click on this, it says there's an error in value. But if I double click on here and I have a look at the calculation, I'm trying to multiply the word Asda by the word Sainsbury's. So value is telling me I'm trying to do something with something that's not a value. So all I would need to do is change my references to be values, and that will then work. Ref is another common one. This one plus this one, and then I will remove this one. So now it's complaining that there is ref error. And what the ref error means is it can no longer find the reference it was using anywhere in the spreadsheet. So I would need to replace that with a different value. It doesn't care if you move it. So I could move this over here and it will change my reference to where I've moved it to. So ref will only appear if you have physically removed the cell it was looking at. Divide by 0, we saw that earlier. If you've dragged something across and you've forgotten to fix a cell reference, that's the most common reason for seeing the divide by 0 error. And there are various other errors that appear in here as well. Null error, a spill error, so the spill range isn't blank. So anywhere where you see a hash and an error message in the cell, it is giving you information about what's wrong. And of course, you can always go and get help on that reference error by clicking on the exclamation mark, and help on this error will take you to Microsoft's help. So that's an introduction to Excel, from the very basics of how we select things and move things around to using some of the basic functions and formulas. In later webinars, we will be showing you how to use lots of other functions and how to use many of the additional things that are available in Excel. And as a couple of examples of maybe less terrifying non-maths based things, I have given you a copy of a pair of dice. Click roll and it will roll the dice and give you a nice little picture. We can build that in one of the later webinars. And I've also included one of the little word puzzles where you get a list of clues and you have to work out the names, the ages, and which superhero they like best. And if you click on a cell, you can select either 1 or 0, 1 for yes and 0 for no. These are just a few of the examples of what is possible with Excel. I can't guarantee I can get Excel to make your coffee in the morning, but I can guarantee that Excel can do wonders for anything that you are doing in a manual, repetitive process. So, for example, if you always delete columns and have to format things with decimal places or as pounds, and you always copy things to a different sheet or save them in a place, then we can show you in these webinars later on how you can simplify that process. So a click of a button, like with the dice, will do all of that for you and super quick. Hopefully you enjoyed this session. If you do have any questions, I'm going to pop over to the Q&A section now, and feel free to stay on and ask any questions. If not, thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll see you on the next webinar.